As the Washington Post once said, 20 years ago, globalization was pitched as a strategy which would raise all boats in rich and poor countries alike. But to truly understand the complicated, interconnected world which we live in, we must delve deeper into the concept.
Globalization refers to the process of which businesses and organizations start operating at a global level, developing international influence. It is connected to the concept of free trade, when borders between countries are only physical and buying and selling between these borders is possible for everybody. The t-shirt you are wearing now began as cotton which was farmed in Texas, which was sent to China to be milled, then Bangladesh to be turned into a plain generic t-shirt, and then it was sent to either Vietnam or back to China to be printed on. After all of that, it was sent to Port Melbourne, then trucks took it to your local retail shop and you bought it. The money you paid for that t-shirt and the money from the millions of other purchased t-shirts, of course, had to compensate for that entire process, pay each worker in each factory and farm who worked to create that t-shirt. And this same process is happening with every industry in the world. Businesses from all around the world now sell their products to a global consumer market at an international scale, hoping to profit off the increased demand and lower production rates. This whole complicated process is measured by three main things: the increased production and consumption of goods, the movement of capital such as investments between countries, and the sharing of information, innovation, and technology.
But while globalization has always been there, like the Silk Road and overseas trade using ships, in the past century there has been a huge spike in the volume of goods and services traded across borders, mainly as a result of advances in transportation and data technology. Economies also realized that by participating in the new global economy, they could create economic growth much quicker, and a series of policies cutting down tariffs and other trade barriers ensued. Organizations like GATT and the WTO were created, and world trade flourished. There has been an extraordinary growth in the international trade over the last couple of centuries. Exports today are more than 40 times larger than in 1913. Statistics also show that over the past 15 years, total trade as a proportion, gross domestic product, GDP, grew by over 50% in Russia, nearly doubled in China, and more than doubled in Brazil and India.
Both produce cotton and wheat to feed and clothe their population. However, country A can produce cotton at $2 kg because of a more suitable soil and the right temperature, while country B only manages to produce it at $3.50 kg because of rocky terrain and a humid climate. However, country B can produce wheat much cheaper at only $1.50 because of favorable conditions for wheat farming, while country A's wheat production falls behind at $3 a kg because that soil cannot produce wheat as efficiently as it does cotton. This natural advantage is a competitive advantage in globalization, the ability to offer a product at a lower price because of different production circumstances and lower production costs. So rather than use their own cotton and wheat, country A should buy country B's wheat but use their own cotton and vice versa. This would ensure that they can both access their required goods and services at the lowest price possible rather than having to grow their own cotton and wheat. Both parties benefit from each other's advantage, and consumers will also be able to spend less for necessities and be exposed to a wider variety of goods and services. A win-win situation, right? However, this also means that private businesses in country A, which once manufactured wheat, have no customers because of their higher prices and are forced to shut down. And the same goes for cotton manufacturers in country B. All the while, other businesses who luckily manufactured the right product from the beginning see huge spikes in business growth because of this increased demand. It also means that if, for some reason, something goes wrong with cotton farms in country A, such as thunder or the farm burns down, then both country A and B will be negatively affected from lack of cotton.
Globalization will be a model which benefits everyone. However, in the current global structure, some economies have gained a much bigger comparative advantage, which translates into more leverage over the global economy. In the 1980s, Asia-Pacific countries such as China, Japan, and Bangladesh entered the global economy when they realized the economic potential of the huge population. In such economies, where there is such high demand for jobs, yet not enough jobs to sustain this demand, employers can get away with paying cheaper wages. In fact, the average wage in China is 8 times less than of a US employee. In these countries, employees cannot protest or demand higher wages, or else they'll lose their job to a person who doesn't have one. These countries also lack regulations, as their governments try to encourage cheap labor. For example, independent trade unions are illegal in China, and local authorities never enforce basic worker rights such as a minimum wage and safe working conditions. All of this, it results in really low population costs for goods because of this, major companies from all around the world, such as Apple, Puma, Nike, Samsung, and Cardiac, have moved their production to these countries. And why wouldn't they, when they can save up to 50% on production costs? However, people in developed countries lose their jobs as manufacturing plants back at home shut down, and these jobs get transferred overseas to the developing countries. China's population also presents one more huge advantage: its immensely spending power. As a result of job increases as well as the emerging middle class, means that China is set to become the world's biggest consumer market by 2025. What all of this means is that every producer depends on China for access to their cheap labor, as well as demand their population creates. While every consumer relies on China for goods and services, the problem with this model is that it gives one country an absolute monopoly through their imports and exports. This poses a range of advantages and disadvantages, and globalization has often been criticized for benefiting some more than others.
From an economic perspective, we begin to realize that there is much more to it than meets the eye. The economic point of view aims for economic growth, which is measured in GDP, and market stability, which is shaped by a range of factors such as interest rates, inflation, deflation, a country's trading partners, supply-demand issues, political issues, as well as society. But because so many things can affect how the economy functions, economists must consider all other lenses too in order to get an accurate reading of the issue. So to an economist, is globalization good or bad? Statistics demonstrate a clear correlation between the amount of global trade and economic growth. This increased growth comes from a few things: increased good and service production efficiency, larger volume of trading in general, and more inter-country investments. The increased cooperation and organization that comes as a result of globalization also means less military conflicts and a better spread of resources. The sharing of information, new technologies, and innovation also means that companies from all around the world will save money on research and development, meaning less production costs, which in turn boosts the world GDP further. In terms of short-term economic stability, the globalization model is quite beneficial too. This is because positive impacts on the overall inflation, trade, and interest rates. Global employment also increases, businesses flourish, and in general the inequality gap gets smaller. Globalization also opens a whole world of opportunities for employees in new industries and new working styles. In new places such as freelancing, immigration for work, and the online market, the World Bank estimates that more than 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty since 1991 because of this job creation, and the trend is set to continue.
We must also consider the implications of globalization in the long term and at a local scale, and as COVID and the 2008 financial crisis has shown us, it's all not good stuff. The big issue here is interdependence, especially on a single consumer, producer, or supply chain. Its volatile nature translates into lack of market stability in the long run. For example, say a business in Melbourne relies on a supply chain in Russia in order to get its natural resources, with which it manufactures its goods. If a black swan event happens like COVID-19, and for some reason the borders close, this business cannot get its resources anymore, hindering its ability to produce its goods. Market stability depends on little things like this, and when interdependence is widespread across the nation, all the economies are interconnected in the sense that instability in one creates instability in another. If we look at the 2008 financial crisis, for example, we realize the ability of an interconnected world to plunge entire economies into recession. Everybody depended on the USA's imports and exports back in the day, and when they experienced an economic backlash, so did all of the USA's trading partners such as China, Australia, and even India. Australia in the COVID-19 scene is also a very good example of this. While Australia does have multiple avenues of trade such as tourism, minerals and agriculture and meat, they all lead to the same major consumer, China. This meant that when China imposed huge tariffs on Australian barley exports in the COVID inquiry issues, the agriculture industry suffered irreparable damage, as the local farmers were not able to turn profit with such low sales. The fact that Australia's economic growth clearly correlates with that of the world economy shows us the extent to which it has become dependent on the success of its trading partners such as China and the USA. Local businesses are also negatively affected by globalization, as many fail to make way for the success of large private corporations. And while overall employment increases globally because of free trade, employees in developed countries lose their jobs as they are sent offshore to cheaper labor, like in China. This is also known as structural employment, where the skills of the population do not match the available jobs in the economy. The problem with this is that it means a country is not going to its maximum potential, as it is not using its most valuable resources, which is its human capital, as efficiently as possible. Research shows that increased exposure to Chinese market clearly correlates with increased unemployment and claims for healthcare and jobless benefits. We can see this when we take a look at the automotive industry in Australia. International competitors were able to offer lower prices because they utilized labor in Asian countries like China and Japan, and while Australian plants suffered from lower demand, eventually they were forced to shut down and transfer to cheaper labor countries. Local plants were shut down and thousands of workers lost their jobs to overseas employees. From this tape, however,
Unemployment. A. Through protectionism policies, which will force local companies to bring production back home. This could happen through tariffs on goods manufactured overseas or other similar policies. However, the downside of this is that it would get rid of some of the jobs in the underdeveloped countries, ruining the progress these countries have made in terms of well-being. Economists also fear that if such policies are implemented, then the local businesses which have been forced to come back rather than employing workers from their own country will turn to automation as a cheaper alternative. This would elevate the unemployment problem even further. B. Retraining individuals in developed countries to take on higher level jobs which cannot be sent offshore. However, this retaining would be time consuming and costly, meaning most people cannot afford it. Implementing a government funded program may counter this, but will never truly compensate for the lost time retraining individuals. It also raises the question, where will these high-end jobs even come from? The truth is that companies and governments will have to create them, to delve into new industries and explore new aspects of work. This solution is so unviable because it would require the government to revise the entire work system into the country. The problem comes back to overpopulation. There are too many people and not enough jobs for these people. If this were the case, then there will always be people unemployed, no matter how economists rearrange their jobs. Therefore, the solution is to create more jobs in developed countries, but how can the governments do this? It would require local businesses to expand and grow, and cater to a consumer base with more spending power. This is created by lower interest rates, unemployment benefits, and cutting tax rates. A richer, more purchase-capable population also ensures that countries like Australia will be able to free itself from dependency on other countries to buy their exports, and also means it increases the leverage Australia has on other countries through its imports. Government projects such as highway infrastructure schemes also create more jobs, so the long-term unemployed could work in them. We see Australia currently doing this, with the big projects underway such as the Metro Tunnel, the Sydney Metro and the West Connects. The good thing about these projects is that the government has contracted them to local construction companies like John Holland or CPBCON. However, they can go further by using local materials to support homegrown industries. Bring major companies back home through incentive rather than by force, as this will
solutions to the interdependence problem. As shown by the 2008 financial crisis as well as COVID-19, this is one of the biggest problems globalization poses. The solution would be an individual trade model which follows the idiom "do not put all of your eggs in one basket" through diversifying income flows and spreading out dependency while still maintaining all the advantages of interdependence and global market. Countries can do this through A. Having multiple supply chains to ensure local businesses can still get what they need to thrive even if one supply chain is cut off by a black swan event. Having multiple trade partners which will ensure economic security and get rid of the volatility factor. For example, if a trade relationship with one country goes south or the demand for your country's product diminishes, those industries can still remain in business through its other trade partners. Australia has already begun doing this, namely seeking out India as a consumer of its beef and agriculture exports. However, an extreme COVID event has ruled this possibility out too. Other potential partners include growing economies like Pakistan, African countries, and even other East Asian countries like Taiwan, Japan, and Korea. The problem with finding new trade partners is that Australia has no realistic market alternative which will provide the magnitude of consumption of China. Let's take iron as an example here. The global market for iron comes up to about 1.26 billion tons of iron per year. China makes up about 800 million tons of this, all from Australia, while the rest of the world is around 460 million tons. Australia already takes up 100 million of this 460 million, which means that the total exports of Australian iron add up to 900 million. If Australia were to stop exporting to China, there would be no one else to buy their iron. A similar scenario applies to many of the other industries of Australia, yet it is less severe. This indicates that while Australia will never truly be free of China dependence, we could still go a long way to reduce possible volatility. C. Relying on international trade less in general. Rather than simply accepting the comparative advantages of other countries, countries should strive to create their own advantage, their own industries, and outdo the competition. If countries' businesses were to have a local consumer base, they would still be able to prosper in the absence of global trade. We have seen the Australian government employs a variety of support, growth, and subsidiary programs in order to encourage employment, grow local industries, and ensure long-term success in the economy. Examples of these include keeper and job seeker, industry budget assistance, and protection through tariffs and subsidies. However, they can do much more in terms of growing local industries, especially through investing into them and growing them, all while reaping the benefits of nationalizing major companies and industries. However, such a solution would not cut off the advantages of globalization. Countries could still dabble in free trade, but the idea is that they won't suffer or become economically handicapped if the unexpected happens, like COVID or a financial crisis, or if a country decides to boycott them.
Viewing globalization from the economic perspective also raises one last question: how important is government intervention in a globalized world? And while it is true that for maximum growth, government should intervene as little as possible, there is more to the economic lens than short-term economic growth. The presence of authority ensures that in the case of the unexpected, like COVID-19 or recession, they're able to inject money into the economy in order to keep the industries afloat. So another way of tackling the volatility of globalization would be to give governments more real powers to make policies and regulate trade. Government policy makes sure that well-being of humanity is not compromised in the chase of profits and economic growth. For example, tariffs, taxes, restrictions on trade practices maintain consumer welfare, health, and safety. The government tries to maintain employment rates, reduce interdependence, protect local business, and reduce the environmental impact. It strives to find a balance to maintain their longevity of economy. However, evidence suggests that globalization has led to growth of major companies and conglomerates to the extent that they can indirectly influence government decisions and in some cases even suppress some policies. We also have many examples of companies who simply ignore rules to no consequence. This is because governments rely on the economic growth created by these private sectors and are thus afraid to implement policies which may hinder this growth. Governments need the power to control companies with considerable oversight without risking market stability. This can perhaps be achieved by a wave of nationalization, where governments try to gain a share in private businesses as to gain more economic.
So that's that for the economic perspective. Let's now look at globalization from the view of an environmentalist. Say you're a rare plant with many uses for medicine, situated in the Brazilian rainforest. Before globalization, only the Brazilians would use you for medicine, and you were more or less able to grow at the rate they cut you down. In comes globalization, and borders are opening up, allowing Brazil to participate in free trade. Demand for the plant skyrockets, and it is cut down faster than it can regrow. The increased rate which globalization brings leads to accelerated depletion of natural resources, and this trend can be seen across many different examples. Demand for goods and services increases because of globalization, and producers increase manufacturing to cope with this. This in turn leads to an increased output of greenhouse gases. As factories are more active and more electricity is required to power these processes. However, we must consider the huge leaps in technology and innovation brought as a result of globalization. This trend is clearly apparent when we look at how many major inventions, such as which were made all possible by joint collaboration between nations. This sharing of technology and information may allow new processes to develop, which may have benefit on the environment. Advances in recycling technology, for example, considerably slow down the rate at which our natural resources are being used up. Clean energy solutions will also reduce emissions of greenhouse gases and will also be brought about much quicker into a globalized environment. So how can we solve resource depletion and increased greenhouse gas emissions? A carbon tax is an option. It refers to a tax on greenhouse gas emissions. This convinced individuals to buy products which affect the environment less in order to save money. Factories will also try to adopt more environmentally friendly processes to lower their prices and increase product demand. However, the problem with such a tax is that it may result in firms moving overseas in order to avoid paying the tax. This can be fixed through a global carbon tax, regulated by organizations such as the United Nations. A carbon tax will also slow down the economic growth and hinder local businesses from flourishing. Another solution would be to implement a tax on goods according to how much limited natural resources it uses up. This would encourage people to buy things which have less effect on the environment, like recycled bottles rather than new ones. However, this also comes back to the same problem as carbon tax, making it unviable in the long run. Incentives are another option too. Rather than using a tax to blackmail consumers and producers into being more environmentally aware, governments can implement incentives, a means of bribing people into buying products which affect the environment less. The problem with this solution is that it would cost the government a lot of money. So our chosen solution is a balanced combination of taxes and incentives, designed to bring about change in the most effective way as possible. That way, governments will be able to pay for the incentives through the revenue generated by the taxes. And if the program is implemented smartly, then neither consumers or producers will be affected to the extent where we start to see the problems.